Hello, I'm ANEKA from Made to Sew. In this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how to find your individual bust point and mark that onto a dressmaking pattern. It doesn't matter here if the pattern has a bust point or not. I'm going to be showing you how to take some measurements on yourself or on someone else that you can then record onto a paper dressmaking pattern. In the following tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how to move the darts, raise them, lower them, move them from side to side, whatever you need to do to make sure they're in the right point for your individual bust apex. Because if you watched my What is Darts tutorial, you will know that darts should point to the fullest part of your figure, so that being the bust apex at the bust area. So we're going to start by taking some measurements. Now, I would recommend that you wear the underwear or a bra that you wear the majority of the time, or that you plan to wear with the garment that you're making. It is really important because you will find that different bras or different underwear have a different effect on your bust, and your bust apex can therefore be in a different position. If you are measuring yourself, then it might be a good idea to put on a snug jersey t-shirt, something that's got a shoulder seam. But make sure the shoulder seam's in the right position. I'll be explaining that shortly, because it just helps you to be able to feel for the seam when we take the measurements from the shoulder seam to the bust apex. I will explain that as we go along. So get a tape measure and we'll start by taking the measurements that you need. Now, the first measurement that you need is the bust apex to bust apex measurement. If you're unsure what a bust apex is, then please watch my What is Bust Apex tutorial. And we're going to be taking that as a flat measurement between the two, from one bust apex to the other. Obviously, if you're doing this on a customer, you might not want to be touching their bust, so you can do this from further away, and that's what I would do for a customer. Now, my mannequin here, I think she's about 7.5 inches. Obviously, record these figures in inches or centimetres, whichever you prefer. And please don't judge yourself based on the measurement of somebody else, because we're all unique. For example, this lady is a US size 4, a UK size 8. You could be the same size as her and have a completely different bust apex to bust apex measurement. Depends on where your bust sits on your individual body. The next measurement we're going to take is from the centre front neck, so in between the two collarbones, right here on my mannequin, down to the bust apex. So that's from here down to the bust apex. I would recommend that you do one for the left and one for the right. You might find that you get slightly different measurements, and I would recommend taking an average, because you might find that one bust is larger than the other, lower, higher than the other. Lots of discrepancies that we can have on our individual figures. Now we're going to move on to the shoulder measurements. So this is where it might be useful, as I said, to wear a snug jersey t-shirt so that you can feel that shoulder seam when you're taking the measurement from the shoulder seam to the bust apex. It allows you just to relax if you're doing it on yourself. If you're doing it on someone else, then that's not so important. You can take a look as to where their shoulder is. Now, where should you measure from in terms of the shoulder? The position of the shoulder seam is slightly debatable, and it depends from designer to designer. Some people like to see the shoulder seam, some people don't. Generally speaking, it's at the sort of highest point of the shoulder. But if you look at it from side on, I would suggest if you divide the neck into 3, that the shoulder seam would be 1/3 of the way from the back of the neck. It should come and sit in the centre of your arm here. So do check that the shoulder seam on the jersey garment you're wearing is in the right place if you're using that as a guide. Now, the measurements we're going to take are, one measurement is from where the shoulder seam meets the neck, so that's right in here. Now, to find this point, think about if you were wearing a nice sort of snug necklace or neck chain and it was sitting right around the base of the neck. That's where this measurement comes from. The other way is if you run your finger down your neck, it can keep going straight down until it can't go down any further, and then it's hit the shoulder. So it's that point. Again, you'll do one for one side, one for the other side, and we're going down to the bust apex. Again, you don't need to touch the bust if you don't need to. It's just a case of holding it so that you can get a nice accurate measurement. The other measurement we're going to take from the shoulder is from the end of shoulder here. Now, that's not from the end of the arm. It is going to be from the seam where the sleeve would be inserted into the armhole. If you're unsure where that is, you're going to want to follow your collarbone out And when you get to the end of your collarbone, you'll sort of hit a bit of a lump at the end of that bit of bone. That should be in line with the crease of your armpit here. So the shoulder seam is always in line with this crease of the armpit. And you'll take a measurement from here down to the bust apex. Again, I don't need to touch the bust, it's just having that measurement there. One on one side and one on the other. The final measurement that you're going to need to take is from the waist. If you're unsure where your waist is, then I recommend watching my How to Measure Yourself video. I show you where the waist is positioned, and I'd also recommend popping a bit of elastic around yourself here so that you're taking this measurement nice and accurately. You're going to take a measurement from the centre front waist. So from your waist point, but at the centre front. So that's going to probably be in line with sort of your belly button, or the centre of your belly button. And you're going to take a measurement from the centre front up to the bust point again. And you'll do the same on both sides and again collect the average. So those are all the measurements we need to move on to the next step. So you can now grab your pattern. You're going to need to keep your tape measure or a ruler out because we're going to be putting these measurements onto your pattern now. So you should now have the following measurements: a bust apex to bust apex measurement, a centre front neck to bust apex measurement, a shoulder neck to bust apex measurement, a shoulder to bust apex measurement, and a centre front waist to bust apex measurement. It doesn't matter if you're working in metric or imperial here. The key is to have all of these measurements recorded. Now, once you've collected all of the measurements, you're going to grab the pattern that you're working with. Now, we took a number of measurements, but you will find that with most patterns, you won't be able to use all of them. You will have to narrow it down to the measurements that you can use on the pattern that you're working with. Now, you'll find that the bust apex to bust apex measurement is quite easy to use, because most of the time you're either going to be working on half of the front, like I've got here, because this is cut on the fold, or if you've got an asymmetrical pattern, you might have a full front piece, or you might just have a full front pattern piece. So the key is to find that centre front line. Either it might be the edge of the pattern, or hopefully it will be marked on your pattern as a line, or even maybe as the grain line. Look for the words centre front. Once you've found the centre front line, you can grab either a ruler or a tape measure, whichever you would like to work with. And you're going to take your bust apex measurements. As I mentioned, on my mannequin, it was 7.5 inches. Doesn't matter if it's centimetres or inches you're working with here. But because I'm only working on half of my front, I need to half my bust apex measurement, because I took a measurement from one bust apex all the way to another bust apex. And I need to have half of that from my centre front. Obviously, again, if you're working with a full pattern piece for the front, then you'll be measuring out both sides of your centre front line. So half of 7.5 is 3 3/4 inches. And obviously on my Copen pattern, you will see that my bust point is in the right place. But for you, you might not have a bust point on your pattern, or you may have, but we're recording your individual measurements. So that's why you're going to need to be recording your measurements onto the pattern. Now, what I recommend that you do here is that you measure your measurement, whatever it might be, from the centre front, and you draw a line. And you do this for a bit of a distance up and down the pattern, because at the moment we only know the width, so the distance between one bust apex and the other. And if you've got a full pattern, you can do this on both sides. And I've drawn a dotted line here for quite a big distance, because what it allows us to do is to plot the other measurements onto this line. We know horizontally where the bust is positioned. What we don't know is how high or low the bust is going to be now. So it's good to do quite a long line. Obviously, you'll be working with a pencil. As usual, I've got my Sharpie out. So this is normally a good one to start with, because on most patterns, you will at least have your centre front marked, or it will be the edge of the pattern like I've got here. You can see that I've gone ahead and drawn my seam allowances everywhere else on the pattern, so that I know the edge of the pattern. Once the garment is sewn, the seam allowances won't be there. And you can see that I haven't got any seam allowances down my centre front because this is cut on the fold, which is why I was able to measure out from the centre front to that bust apex, and I used half of my bust apex figure. Now, once you have got your first measurement on, you can start to look at the other measurements that you could use. So let's think about our options. We took a measurement from the centre front neck, that's going to be up here somewhere, to the bust apex. However, we've got to think, does this coping pattern finish at the neck in between the two collarbones? It doesn't. I know that because I drafted the pattern, but obviously if you're working with a pattern that you haven't made before, you're going to want to have a look at some pictures of what the pattern should like, either on the pattern envelope or even on the internet. If you're working on a shirt pattern, you would take a measurement from the centre front edge here onto the dotted line. You've already plotted that line for the width of the bust, so we would measure onto that. And my lady measured 8¼ inches from the centre front down to her bust, and that is wrong. That's going to be down here somewhere. And as I said, that's because the coping neck is lower than in between the two collarbones. So I'm not going to be able to use that measurement on this pattern. What other measurements did I take? Well, we took a measurement from the shoulder neck. So that's this point up here down onto the bust apex. Again though, I know the pattern that I drafted, and I know that this isn't close enough to be considered that shoulder neck point. I actually moved it out away from the neck slightly. Again, if you're working with a shirt with a collar, something like that, you will find that that will be sitting much closer to the neck. So that will be a good measurement to use. Take a look at the picture, have a look, does that neckline on that pattern look like it sits right up against the neck on this point of the shoulder? If it doesn't, then it's unable to be using that one. But if you were using it, you would take your measurement down like so, again onto your dotted line. Now, another measurement that we took for the shoulder was the end of shoulder onto the bust point, and that measurement we can use here. The coping pattern sits on the end of the shoulder, and we can take that measurement to the bust point, just like so. And my lady measured 9 inches, so that's pretty good there. It's on the bust marking that I've already got on this pattern. Obviously, let's do it as if you didn't have a bust marking on your pattern. Let's take another colour, let's go for blue. And I would mark and say, yeah. Because if you have got more than one point that you can take a measurement for, I would measure all of them, draw them all on and check that they should be coming to the same place. If they're not coming to the same place, then either you might want to retake a measurement, or you might want to consider that that bit of the pattern isn't where you think it is on the person. For example, the shoulder neck point may have moved out from the neck slightly, or the centre front neck point may be lower than in between the two collarbones. Just something to consider. The shoulder again needs to be sitting right on the end of the shoulder. We don't want that to be coming off, being a drop shoulder or sitting over the top of the arm at all, because then it would again change that measurement. Obviously, if it's a sleeveless garment, you need to consider again, is that sitting further in than the end of the shoulder? Again, take a look at the picture on the pattern, have a look on the internet and see what it looks like on real people. But if you've got more than one measurement that you can put onto your pattern, it's great, because then you might find that one is an anomaly or one measurement is inaccurate, but the rest of them put your bust point in the right place. So the other measurement we can take with the coping pattern that we know is going to work is the waist centre front up to the bust apex. So my waist, again, is marked on this pattern. You will want to have a look to see if the waist is marked on your pattern. It may be marked, or it may even be a seam if perhaps you have got a waist seam. And I'm going to continue that across, you do that in red so you can see, to the centre front, just like so. Now, the waist at my centre front is here. That is the point that we took the measurement on the mannequin. So again, we're going to be coming up from the waist at the centre front, no seam allowance on this edge because it's cut on the fold. and I'm going to be coming up onto my dotted line, and I wanted 7.5 inches, which again puts my bust point there. So it's in the same place as the measurement I took from the end of shoulder down to the bust apex, which is great news. Now, the one thing I'd like you to consider with this measurement, and with all of them really, is that if the garment was very fitted and it really fitted around the breast, you might find that this measurement would be longer and you would actually have to take a more fitted measurement on the figure. Because we took this as a relatively flat measurement, which is fine for this pattern. It doesn't fit in this area. So my measurement on my mannequin is exactly the same as the measurement on the pattern. But it might be different if the pattern was more fitted and fitted in under the breast. Just something to consider. So let's briefly take a look at all of the lines. I've drawn them all onto the pattern that you could work with. So we had our bust apex to bust apex. Working on half the pattern, like I am here, you're going to need to divide this in half. Working on a full pattern, then it would be your full measurement. And that was a measurement that I could use on this pattern and that you'll hopefully be able to use most of the time, as long as you know where that centre front line is. Then we had our centre front waist up to the bust apex. That one I can use on this pattern. We had our centre front neck to the bust apex. This is in red because we couldn't use it on this pattern. The centre front neck was too low and it would be inaccurate. We also had where the neck meets the shoulder to the bust apex. Again, it wasn't accurate on this pattern. The pattern finished too far away from the neck here. However, another measurement that we could use was the end of shoulder down to the bust apex, and that was nice and accurate. So that's why we take lots of measurements, because it allows you to work with the measurements that will work with your pattern that you're working with. Once you have got your bust apex marked, you're then going to need to consider whether you need to move the darts. Again, the location of the darts on your pattern might be different to mine, but I'm going to be doing a tutorial that will show you how to raise or lower the darts or move them from side to side if they're waist darts, so that they're in the right place for your individual bust apex. Remember that the bust apex is where the darts should be pointing. That's the fullest part of that area. So the darts should be pointing to the fullest part, which is the bust apex. I would recommend, once you have gone through all of this, moved the darts, and you've got your bust apex marked, that you do make up a sample garment and clearly mark the bust apex on it. This will allow you to double check that you've got it in the right place and that you're happy with the position of the bust apex. If you would rather not take these measurements, or perhaps you want to make a sample garment to try on your customer or friend, whoever you're making a garment for, then you could make up the garment and mark the bust apex on the garment if the pattern has one. That will allow you to again check whether the bust apex on the pattern is in the right place for your customer or whoever you're making the garment for. If it isn't in the right place, then you will need to mark their individual bust apex onto the sample garment and compare either the original bust apex on the pattern with the new placement, or perhaps take the sample garment apart, lay it down on top of the pattern and mark the bust apex of their measurement onto the pattern. That's if the pattern doesn't have a bust apex you can compare it to. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed the process of positioning your individual bust apex onto your dressmaking pattern. In the next tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how to move the darts accordingly, so raise or lower them to work with your individual bust apex. Thanks for watching and see you soon.